Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this session on the very sexy topic of contracts. God, it's noisy, isn't it? Oh, it's not this now. I'm very pleased to welcome our panel. So on my left here we have Alex Zucker, who's come from the States, who is from American Penn's Translation Committee. Yes, is that how you call it? Yeah. We have Sarah Burton, who is the advisor at the Society of Authors on Translation Contracts, and Ra Page, who is the founder of the publishing house Comma Press. So Alex has had a good look at our contract, and he's going to talk us through some of the differences between American contracts and British contracts. And interestingly, it's American Pen that has the model contract in the States, rather than the Translators Association, ALTA. It's become increasingly common that British publishers are contracted directly by American publishers and vice versa. So I think it's very helpful for us to know what is realistic to expect from an American contract. And Sarah's going to talk about some of the observations that she's made over the last year or so, because Sarah sees a lot of contracts. We all send her our contracts to vet, and we're very, very grateful for the help that you give us. So she's going to be able to give us a sort of an overview of what's going on in the world of contracts. And Ra's going to talk from the publisher's point of view of what's realistic at this particular point in publishing, what the constraints are on the publishers that we as translators might not be aware of. And then we'll take questions from you. And you have been given copies of the American model contract and the TA model contract. If you need us to send you one, we can email them to you if you haven't got one to take away. Okay, so Alex.
Hello. Okay. The first thing I'd like you all to do is to hold up your model contract in the air so I can get a picture. Okay. Wonderful. Thank you. That was for my co-chair, Margaret Carson, who I hope will come next year. So before I talk about the contract, I just want to show you. It doesn't matter if you don't have a copy of the contract here, because the contract is posted on the PEN America website. Pen.org/translation is our homepage. And if you see on the left-hand side there under Translation Resources, the second item is the model contract. And don't miss the FAQs, which are directly underneath it, which answer some of the questions connected to the contract itself.
Alex, I think you might have to speak louder. Can you all hear?
I'm talking pretty close to the mic. Okay.
Yeah.
So there's the model. I mean, it links off of the page. I just want to give you an idea so that when you go on the website, you're not completely lost. There's the model contract. I couldn't get to show the whole screen, but the FAQs, so you can see the kinds of questions that are in the FAQs, from how do I obtain rights to a foreign title to who should hold the copyright, ever a hot topic, subsidiary rights. So some of these things, reversion clause, some of these things have to do with contract, and some of them have to do with publishing in general. And the other thing I want to point out, I'm going to come back to this when I sit back down and talk, is that we are in a different position in the United States from what you have here in the UK, in that the organization that the model contract was created by the Translation Committee of PEN America in 1981 originally. We do have an organization comparable to the Society of Authors in the United States. It's called the Authors Guild. This is the website I'm showing you right there. They're the organization that you can join, which provides contract review. So we have a very different arrangement, and it has some implications, which I'll talk a little bit more about in my little presentation, but that's it for now. So can I make that go away? Okay. So the first thing I want to talk about is I'm really just going to talk about. I'm not actually going to do a side-by-side comparison, but I want to talk about some of the things that you're likely to encounter in the United States in literary translation contracts that you may not be used to in the UK. And I think the biggest one and the one that's most controversial has to do with copyright. And that is that the idea of a work-for-hire contract, meaning that the copyright belongs to the publisher rather than you as the creator and author of the translation, is still, I wouldn't say it's common in the United States, and I don't believe that it is on the rise. There are some people who believe that, but they're saying that based on anecdotal evidence rather than any statistics. But it isn't uncommon, and particularly with university presses, it isn't out of the question that the contract that they send you will be a work-for-hire contract where the copyright belongs to the university. There are some trade publishers, particularly a few that do literary translations, that still will send you a contract that has the copyright belonging to the publisher. They're pretty infamous. You can find their names all over the internet. What we do at Penn, since we're not a union, we can't force our members to sign or not sign particular types of contracts. What we're doing is saying that we believe, I mean, you are the author of the translation when you translate a novel or any literary work. You are the creator of that. Roz, I'm sure, will talk a little bit more about or Sarah, about the legal underpinnings for that. But it is up to you as the individual translator to insist that the copyright is yours, that it's not the publishers to give you, it is yours, and you grant it a license to the publishing house to use your translation under the terms that you create in the contract. Just because a publishing house sends you a work-for-hire agreement doesn't mean that you have to accept it. Even if it's a university publishing house that has never done one before, I can say, not too long ago, I was sent a contract by a university publishing house that was a work-for-hire agreement. I found a book on my shelf that they had published in which the translator had the copyright. I wrote to the editor and I pointed this out to her. She said, "Oh, well, that's the standard contract we have." And I said, "I know that's your standard contract. What I'm saying is that there's a book here on my shelf that has the copyright with the translator. Could you ask your legal department about it?" She did, and I got the copyright. So the point is that a contract is something that you negotiate with a publisher. It's not something that you either accept or reject based on the first version they send you. But that is, I think that is the single biggest difference between the United States and the United Kingdom, is that we still, work-for-hire agreements are not unheard of to the extent that they are in the UK. Another one has to do with payment and royalties. I know that it is not uncommon in the UK for royalties to begin from the moment that a book starts to sell, whereas typically in the United States, the payment that you receive will be let's say it's $130 per 1,000 words. I'm just using that as a ballpark figure. The money that you get is considered an advance on royalties, and you won't be paid royalties if you have royalties in your contract. And again, in our model contract, we suggest that you should, although we don't specify the amount, and I can talk about what you're likely to encounter. That once the book has earned enough to earn back enough to the publisher to cover your advance, then you would start earning royalties, whereas in the UK you're more likely to get them from the beginning. Getting your name on the cover is another thing that is actually relatively easier to do these days in the United States. It's not always going to be on the front cover. And again, I want to stress that this is something to negotiate, and just because a publisher isn't including that in the initial contract when they send it to you doesn't mean that you can't ask for it or shouldn't ask for it or even explain why your name should be on the cover. A reversion of rights clause is a very important part of the contract, since if you have the copyright But when the book goes out of print, it doesn't specify in your contract that when the book goes out of print, the rights revert to you. The book can easily die out. This is something we consider really important because as translators, a lot of us are really discovering authors, and you could do, say, early in your career, or not early in your career, you could translate an author who turns out to be big, and maybe nobody was interested in her first book, but then down the line, the author becomes really famous in the third or fourth book, and meanwhile the first book's gone out of print, and there wasn't a reversion of rights clause. The rights belong to the publisher, and you have no way to get the rights back to sell it to somebody else and put the book back into print. So that's something, again, to point out to the publisher. There should be a reversion of rights clause in here. This is our model contract is a very standard version of that. It's pretty simple. Rates, again, this is an area of difference between the United States and the UK, as has come up already once today. I'm sure it'll come up again. The Translators Association within the Society of Authors here has an observed rate of, is it now £90 per 1,000 words? We have not been able to do a survey, or we haven't done a survey yet in the U.S. But what we do say in our FAQs at the Penn Translation Committee is that we've observed a range of, I think we say between 10 and 18 cents a word among our members. Now, Penn members are translators who have already published at least one book, so that doesn't include people who are, publishing their first book-length translation. So, again, this is a negotiated rate. Something that we're thinking about doing right now in the United States is talking with the National Endowment for the Arts to see if they might be willing to suggest a rate in the grants that they give to publishing houses, the way the English Pen does when it gives grants to publishers through its grant program. The Penn America does have a grants program, but our grants go directly to translators, so we don't have any leverage there to influence publishers when it comes to anything, including rates. I guess the other thing I should say, just as a sort of background, is the fact that we do have our translators represented across 4 different organizations in the United States, and so there is no organization that can speak with one voice for translators the way that the Translators Association can here. As I said, I'm from the Pan America Translation Committee. There is also the American Literary Translators Association. Then there is the American Translators Association, which has a literary division, and then there is the Authors Guild. And as a literary translator, we're eligible to join any of these organizations or all of these organizations. But the only one that has lawyers is the Authors Guild, but it doesn't have a special section for translators. So it does create, it's a more complicated landscape in terms of figuring out who really speaks for translators when it comes to these contractual issues. Penn, of course, historically has been involved in freedom of speech issues, but doesn't engage in advocacy on contracts or copyright. So I think I'm going to leave it with that.
Okay, thank you. And do you have somebody who will vet contracts the way we have at the Society of Authors? Do you have a Sarah?
The Authors Guild has a couple of Sarahs.
Okay, thank you.
One of them is named Michael. I use them all the time.
Okay, thank you. That was very informative. Okay, Sarah, what have you observed over the last year?
I should say, first of all, it's not a one-woman team. There's 5 or 6 of us at the Society of Authors looking at contracts.
Can you speak louder?
Sure. We do see a real range, so I'm just going to give you an overview of the different kinds of translation contracts we see. The vast majority is between translators and traditional UK publishers, but we're also seeing now a handful of contracts with digital-only publishers. That's something that's relatively new for translators. We see a number of overseas contracts, although we don't claim to be experts on those. We also see contracts between translators and literary agencies. That does come up quite often. and also increasingly contracts directly between translators and authors. And in those cases, the author is sometimes self-publishing, or they might have the funds to pay for the full translation themselves, and they then want to subsequently find an English language publisher. So there's a real range, but when I'm talking about the detail of the contract here, I'm focusing on the UK traditional publishers. So Alex talked a bit about rates, and as he said, we do sort of observe that generally in the UK, publishers will pay about £90 per 1,000 words. We don't want to, that's not a set rate by any means, and we don't want to create a kind of ceiling there. By all means, translators should feel free to negotiate higher than that if they feel that it's possible. And royalties as well. We do see royalties in the vast majority of translators' contracts. I should say that most of the time, actually, that the rate per 1,000 words actually in the UK does tend to be in advance, like in the US. It's quite rare to see it as a fee plus royalties. I mean, that's the ideal scenario, but don't see it very often. We see separate print and ebook royalties. That's something that sort of settled down in the last few years. To start with, translators weren't really getting their share on ebooks, but now that's kind of settled at around a 5% royalty. I'd say actually one of the main problems at the moment in contracts is with subsidiary rights. And these are the rights where the publisher effectively acts as agent. So they don't directly exploit the rights themselves, but they're selling them to a third party. So your UK publisher might sell American rights to a US publisher, or they might sell rights to adapt for other mediums such as TV or radio. And I think it's important that translators receive a share on that, and all too often they don't. So it's something to really watch out for in contracts. So as we've just been talking about, we do have a model contract. I do think that the majority of UK publishers incorporate elements of that into their agreements. Tends to be, I would probably say that the smaller independent publishers tend to rely on it more than the larger publishers, who perhaps have sort of group policies where they can't be quite as flexible about terms. It varies, and there are obviously pros and cons to going with a smaller publisher and a larger publisher. Besides payment, there's obviously a lot of other details that you want to look out for in contracts. One of the key things, in the UK, we've been talking about talking about copyright. In the US, it can be slightly different. As a starting point in the UK, with a traditional publisher, we would expect the translator to retain copyright and grant a set of exclusive rights. And generally speaking, we would expect that set of rights to be the same rights that the publisher has bought in the original foreign language work. Not always the case. Often the publisher wants to acquire a wider grant of rights from the translator than they already own in the original work. But that's something that we do check contracts for. And as Alex also said, we're quite careful about termination clauses, making sure that the translator can get their rights back. I would say the key thing we're looking for actually is that if the publisher no longer has rights in the original work, then the translator's rights should revert too. So whilst I totally agree that out-of-print wording is really important, I do think that for translators it's particularly crucial that they have that wording, so if the publisher doesn't own the original work anymore, they can't own the translation too. And just another point to mention to look out for is approval. You often see this kind of wording in a translator's contract, that payment can be subject to approval of the translation. And that's just something to be a bit careful about. You need to know who has the final say over your work. Is it possible that the author could have any say? If so, how is that process going to work? Just another point that we do tend to flag up, I think. That's probably all I'll say for now.
Can I just ask you, Sarah, the definition of out of print? In the old days when we only worked in print, it meant there were no more copies available. But in the digital age, what does out of print actually mean?
Well, I mean, often termination clauses haven't really been adapted to take that into account, actually, because obviously an ebook is going to remain available perpetually. A publisher might also have print-on-demand versions, and this could mean they hang on to the rights indefinitely, even if it's no longer selling. So what we tend to suggest is there's a minimum sales threshold. So if sales fall below, say, 200 copies over a 12-month period, then the translator should be able to get their rights back. But of course, you're quite tied to what is in the author's contract with the publisher as well. So it can be quite hard for a translator to negotiate wording that's different to that the author has, which is why we say, try and make sure you have that wording that your rights revert if the authors have reverted.
Thank you. Ra, you are the owner of an independent publishing house that publishes a lot of translations. So would you like to comment on what our two speakers have said?
I'd love to. First of all, I should say that everything I say is very particular to comma. We publish short fiction, so it's a very sort of unique kind of market. And also, I can't really comment on other publishers' practices. But I think it's been really interesting looking at the American model because it's so different. The very language of the American contract is utterly different to the language of the British contracts. It's very writer-orientated. It says the writer will do this and the writer will do that. And it's almost proper English. I mean, it's almost illegible. The English contracts have this kind of legalese formed standard to them, which at first glance is kind of a little bit off-putting. It's difficult to have these long, winding clauses and sub-clauses, and it's very, very strange. But it's basically it talks about the product and it sets out its definitions really, really early on. Ross, you asked about what is out of print. Any contract kind of that we deal with would have to explain what out of print means. It has to explain all of its terms, and so a standard British contract really gets that up front. Really, it says what the license is, what the term of the licenses are, and sometimes it will go hand in hand with the original rights contract. So information that's in the original rights contract will just be matched with your contract. So that may go into the price of the book and print runs and things like that, other things that were discussed with the original publisher or the writer. So it's a very, very different beast, and the British contracts that I've looked at are quite frightening if you're not used to them. Also, I should just say, when dealing with short fiction, which I guess is kind of a rare case, there are two different types of approaches. If we're putting together an anthology, we will not offer royalties on individual stories because it means that we have to divide royalties by anywhere between 20 and 40 different contributors. And the maths is mind-boggling and the paperwork is mind-boggling, and it's just not worth it because obviously you've got 10 to 20 contributors and 10 to 20 potentially translators as well. So for anthologies, it will just be a flat fee. And for single author collections, and I guess novels as well, it's usually just a straightforward advance against royalties. I've never seen a fee plus advance against royalties. Also, we would perhaps talk, because it's a short form, we would perhaps divide the license into two types. So a non-exclusive license, an exclusive license for a short period, which may be 12 months or a year, and then a non-exclusive license, which may be up to 10 years after that. So this allows the writer of the original story to move their story around and take the translator with them after a short period, so they can appear, as a single story in serialization form, or in a newspaper or magazine, or in another book. So again, it's particular to the short story. Also, I should say that as an independent publishing house, we're not making money out of literary translations, and I think sometimes the role of the publisher, especially as the agents become more and more important, the role of the position of the publisher is sometimes slightly maligned. We're slightly looked upon or regarded as always trying to make money. A lot of the time, we're actually we're looking for translators who will kind of collaborate with us. We're investing money. Most of the time, we don't know if we're going to get it back. We never know if we're going to get it back, and we're taking enormous risks on anything. So we kind of we looked for translators who have a kind of spirit of solidarity in that process. Although obviously we want to protect their rights as well, and sometimes because a lot of our funding comes from our translation costs may be covered by grants, whether it's European funding or whether it's a particular cultural agency or embassy, or whether it's the wonderful English pen. We will often be required to get both the author and the translator to give their provisional agreements up front, and then the existence of the book is kind of conditional or dependent on the grant being awarded. So you get this strange clause in some of our contracts that says at the end of everything you've signed, you've agreed a lot of things, and at the end it says if we don't get our funding or 70% of our funding by this such and such a date, you will be notified, and this contract is null and void. So don't be alarmed by that. Also, as a publisher who doesn't speak any of the languages that we translate from, and most publishing houses' legal departments may not speak that language as well, we ask our translators to help us as much as possible in feeling their way through a text when a text is originally suggested, especially with individual short stories. So we have, through experience, kind of learned to ask translators to give a text a once over, to look for certain things and to alert us to certain things before they start the translation. So a few years ago we published a translation of a story from Norwegian by a wonderful Norwegian writer called Frode Gritten about a Smiths fan, and in the Norwegian there are endless quotations from Smith songs, but to translate back into English, well, it wasn't really translating, it was going back to the original Smiths lyric. We realised that the original copyrights hadn't been paid for those by the original publishing house. So we were stung by a massive bill, 2 bills, which we didn't expect. And we didn't know what the size of them would be. One by Morrissey and the other by Johnny Marr, because they both have copyright on those lyrics. And it cost us an absolute fortune. Another time, a couple of other times, kind of inappropriate material, by which I mean libelous, blasphemous, offensive, etc. Material has appeared in a translation, and it's only appeared to us, or we've only been alerted to it once the translation's come in. By that point, we've already agreed to pay it, but we've not been able to publish it because it's just inappropriate and not very nice. So we've lost money that way. So since then, we've asked, we might have a little clause in the contract to say translators will alert us to this kind of material. And again, we define that on our website. Alert us to this kind of material, just to help us in that process. So.
Listening to what Sarah and Rob have said, I think it's important for me to emphasize that the PEN America model contract is a very bare bones contract. It doesn't contain a lot of the language that you're likely to see. I'm thinking about this, the issue of libelous or facts or language. You're likely to find something about that in your contract. The PEN model contract focuses on what I would call sort of the hot button issues that are of primary concern to most literary translators. It's not an exhaustive model contract the way that the Translators Association one is. So it's why it's a good idea. Again, when you get your contract back from the publisher in the U.S., you're going to compare it to this and see that there's a whole lot of clauses that are not even considered in this model contract. And that's when it's a good idea to consult a lawyer if you can, or again, if you can join the Authors Guild and get a contract reviewed there. If you want to, you can also, of course, talk to somebody you know who has experience with contracts, but that's not legal advice. The other thing I thought was interesting was about the digital rights, and that's something that this contract is definitely not up to date on. What the Authors Guild in the United States has been saying is that they're pushing for authors to get 25% royalties on ebooks. So if you followed that logic, translators would get 12.5%. But in most of the contracts that I've heard about people getting, if you get a 1% royalty, you're doing well.
I mean, I would say 25% is usual for in author contracts, and of that 25%, the translator here receives 5%. I mean, our general feeling is that all royalties should be split in the same proportion. So your print royalties and your ebook royalties and income on subsidiary rights, there should be, if say the translator is receiving a fifth of the royalty income, that should apply across all the different formats and all the different rights.
So I think what's beginning to emerge here is that there's no one size fits all, that publishing houses are all very different. It's very different if you're dealing with a great big, multinational group or a small independent publisher. And I think sometimes we lose sight of the fact that we're actually all trying to do the same thing here. We're all trying to get really good literature published in translation. And I think, working collaboratively with the publisher rather than having a sort of them and us approach, sort of evil publishers oppressing poor translators, is not helpful. And it's up to each of us to work out which publishers we do want to work with in that way. And I think trying to understand from their side what the constraints are, and finding a way of working together. I mean, one of the things that I find on the royalty front is to sometimes say to publishers, well, okay, I know you're paying a generous fee for the translation of this book. If it's considered as an advance against royalties, it will probably never earn out. But in the event that the book does sell a lot more than either of us anticipate, how about a royalty, and then setting a sort of a threshold saying, what would you feel comfortable with? If it sold 20,000 copies and you're well into profit, how about a royalty from that point? And a lot of publishers who might not agree or be able to afford a royalty from copy number one will say, yeah, that's fair enough. It's kind of like an insurance policy. It's saying, well, look, I've translated this book. If it is an unexpected success, how about a little bit more for me? And I've never had a publisher refuse that. So I think it's about, and as Alex said, it's about negotiation and not saying, going in sort of all guns blazing from the start. So unless anybody else has got anything to say, I'm going to take questions. Does anybody have any? Yeah, an arm. Hello. Do you want to say who you are?
Yes, I'm Richard Dickson. It seems as if a lot of publishers rather like the idea of holding back 50% of the advance until publication, including Penguin. What do you think about that?
Holding back 50% of the advance until publication?
Yes. I've never had to do it before. I'm a bit surprised to be asked this time.
I would say it's usual for translators in the UK to receive half of their advance on signature and half on delivery. It's unusual to have to wait till publication, and if I saw that in a contract, I would always encourage a translator to challenge it. It's not normal.
No, and publishers sometimes delay publication for reasons that are nothing to do with your translation. And another thing you can think about negotiating, especially if it's a big book that's going to take you a long time, is the stage payments. So I've done books where I've been paid a monthly amount for a year, which suited me and suited the publisher. That, I think, is something that's negotiable as well. Do you want to comment on that, Rob?
I completely agree, but I see it as a sort of a growing trend that more and more of it's being held back till publication. And likewise, when buying rights, I've often sold international rights for a book, and the buyer has demanded that they only pay on publication. So a book is kind of out of circulation; nobody else can buy it, and we just have to wait and hope and pray that the book actually gets published. But that's increasingly a tactic that's used to reduce risk. But yeah.
What happens in the States? Do you get paid on delivery?
What Sarah said is the most typical situation in the States as well. Half when you sign the contract, half when you deliver the manuscript. Although I have encountered a contract that's paid 1/3 of the advance on signing, 1/3 on acceptance of the manuscript, not delivery. And I'm waiting right now for about 6 months for a manuscript of mine to be accepted. And the last third on publication. So there, you can find that, but again, you can negotiate, but the most typical is half on signing, half on delivery of the manuscript.
I think just to add about acceptance, so that can be a real issue if you don't know when acceptance is going to come. So I would always suggest that translators try and have a time frame built into their contract. So acceptance has to be given within 30 days of delivery, because all too often I've seen it where translators are kept waiting and they're kept waiting for their payment as well. And that can be really frustrating to be kept in limbo like that.
I mean, one of the things about that is if you've done a sample and the publisher has commissioned your translation on the basis of your sample and the rest of your translation is of the same quality as your sample, I mean, they can be deemed to have accepted, at that point. And if you I think one of their anxieties is that you're going to deliver your translation, then just run off to South America or something. They're never going to see you again. So if they've got issues with it, they won't be able to discuss them. So I think if you can make it known that you are available and willing and happy to discuss with the editor, they're more willing to pay on delivery if they've got that assurance that you're not going to disappear as soon as you've put it on their desk. And sorry, do you want to?
No, I was just saying.
Oh, a question?
Yeah, it was just on that subject. My name's Carolyn, and I've just finished a translation.
Can you speak louder?
I've finished my first book translation, and I had exactly that clause in my contract, and it said on acceptance. And it wasn't a problem in the end, but beforehand, I didn't know whether the acceptance was when I delivered, on deliverance, whether when I delivered my translation or when they were finished with all the edits, because it went on for months and months and months to finally get to the agreed version of the manuscript. So what would you normally say? When is even delivery? Or
Delivery is when you deliver your completed translation, isn't it, Sarah?
Yes, yeah. And like I say, if it says acceptance in a contract, you would ideally have them specify that acceptance must be within 30 days of delivery.
But would that include the editing process? So I deliver, then we edit, and then they accept?
No, I wouldn't expect that to happen so quickly. I would just say you've delivered the text. Within 30 days, you should know, have they accepted it, and also ideally to discuss, if there is any if there are any amendments that need to be made. Okay. I mean, I think translators can probably talk more about the editing process than I can, but I would say the 30 days window is really important.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, so that's a really loud and clear message, isn't it? If it says acceptance in your contract, get it changed to delivery. Any more questions? Yeah.
Thank you. I wanted to talk a little bit more about this question of advance versus fee, because something must have changed. And if so, please tell me about it. I remember 10 years ago going to the website of American Pen and downloading a wonderful contract that provided for a fee and royalties, and using that contract without any difficulties to then conclude a very good agreement with the publisher. And now, of course, things have changed. The worry is, at the level of royalties that we are generally accorded as translators, how many of us actually ever would earn back in advance? And is it not worth thinking a little bit more about the possibilities, always in a spirit of mutual generosity, that we could explore?
So you're saying that if the fee that we're paid is considered as an advance against royalties, we're very unlikely ever to earn out those royalties, so that we should have a different formula for when the royalties start.
I think so.
That's your question?
Also, that I'm very surprised, because unless I've dreamt it, but I couldn't have, because the contract I did sign 10 years ago is still there. Things seem to have been going backwards rather than forwards. It's very baffling for me.
Sarah, do you want to comment on that?
I mean, I've been doing this looking at contracts for about 6 years, and I would say in that time it has always generally been that it's an advance plus royalties, occasionally seeing a fee plus royalties. But I don't know if, Ros, in your experience, if it's changed much in your time as a translator. But I mean, I would say I wasn't doing it 10 years ago, so I don't know if it changed rapidly in that period. I don't know, but I would say that it does tend to be more an advance. I don't know how sustainable it would be as well for publishers to pay fees plus royalties whilst also paying their underlying rights holder. I don't know.
Well, they've hardly been happy
the
and
only
easy
way-
years for any of us.
Sorry?
They've hardly been happy or easy financial years for publishers or for any of us, granted. But I'm just wondering if it might be worth sort of thinking about this, because aside from knowing quite a number of very talented translators who are struggling, let alone with the vulgarities of paying the rent, but with basic survival, there seemed to be something that is missing, i.e. the fact that it's very good to have your name on the cover and to say you have much more dignity, but we are not the authors. The level of royalties that we do get is nowhere near that of an author. So the advance model generally doesn't seem to me to be working very well for us. So my question is it worth altogether working something out and thinking about it a bit more?
Well, I think what works is negotiating with the publisher a threshold after which it's viable for them to pay a royalty. And, I think we need to be aware of the fact that, literary publishing is not in a very good place at the moment. A lot of books aren't selling very many copies. Nobody's making that much money. So I don't think it's reasonable to start asking for royalties on top of a fee until the publisher's beginning to make money on it. And I think that's where we have to establish with the publisher what that threshold is. There is one publisher that pays royalties from day one, I know, but they're part of a big house. For the independent publishers, who are the ones doing the most books in translation, I don't think at this point that's possible, much as many of them would probably like to do that. Any other questions?
I've got a question about libelous content. Because can you hear me all right? A few years ago, I was interested in translating an autobiography which had some controversial content. I didn't get anywhere with agreeing it. The author was interested, but I didn't have much interest from the publisher. But then later on, I discovered that there were a couple of libel suits pending in France, which was the country of origin, and perhaps that explained why that they were not very keen on having it translated or sold into other countries. I had two questions in my mind listening to what you said, and one was, is it ever a good idea to try to translate something that's already controversial in that way? Because to me it was interesting because it was controversial and therefore marketable, so that was one of the reasons I was interested in it. But the other is, what is the liability on me as a translator? I'm not adding to the libelous content, but I am translating it. So is there a potential risk there to the translator as well as to the UK publisher or the US publisher in that case?
Did everybody hear the question? It's about libelous content and what is the translator's responsibility if a book has libelous content. Sarah, do you want to...
Yeah, to say a translator should never be responsible for the content of the original work, and it should be clear in your contract that that the publisher will indemnify you in the event that anything came up in a text that was libelous. So you would just be asked to warrant that you won't introduce anything new into the text, and on that understanding, the publisher will protect you. But, and then the author, in their contract with the publisher, they would be making warranties to the publisher, so it should fall back on them. But whether any publisher would still want to take the risk is another matter. But
I suppose really the question is, if you know the language and the publisher doesn't, then perhaps you have a responsibility to alert them so that they can make an informed decision rather than not telling them and then they get something and they realise that they've paid for a translation of something that they weren't aware of.
And different countries have different libel laws, so maybe you could pitch it at the American market because they have slightly looser libel laws.
I know that the Authors Guild, when they've reviewed my contracts and found clauses like that, have always suggested that I ask them to insert the phrase "to the best of the translator's knowledge," that it doesn't contain any libelous content because,
Your knowledge could be limited.
yeah.
Okay, does that answer your question? Thank you. Any other questions? Over here, please.
Hello. I was just wondering, fees per 1,000 words, would that be of the original text or of the translator's text?
I think it varies, and it should be stated in the contract which it should be. I think translators themselves can probably say better than I, because I think it can differ between different languages, but whichever it is, it should be clear at the outset.
And it does depend enormously on the language. I mean, some languages are much shorter in the source language and some are much longer. So as long as you and the publisher are on the same page when you're discussing it, I mean, nowadays it's much easier to get a hold of the original in electronic format, so you can actually count and both agree at the start that this is how many 1,000 words it is. So as long as you're agreed, that's fine.
Usually for clarity, it's we've always stated it in the target language, so in English. And I think the recommended rates are generally regarded as recommended rates in the target language. So the 89, 90 pound per 1,000 word, which is the Translators Associated recommended rate, when applying to grants, it's usually in the target language.
So that's really your preference as a publisher?
Yeah, well, it takes out a certain amount of sort of guesstimation in terms of how much it's going to cost.
So the translator might be tempted to sort of make their translation longer.
Yeah.
Well, I know I translate from Czech, and the final, it tends to be shorter in English. Well, it depends, but my final version is always shorter than the first draft I hand in. So if I'm being paid based on the first manuscript I submit to them versus the final version, I'm going to be making less money if we do it based on the final version. Usually English ends up being longer. If you translate from Chinese or Japanese, how are you doing the word count with that? I know it depends on what language, yeah.
Any other questions? Comments?
Hello, my name is Josefina, and I would like to ask if you can do anything if you realize that you signed a contract that's perhaps not as good as it should be.
If you've signed a contract and you realise afterwards it's not as good, is there anything you can do about it?
Yes. I'm going to say yes. I mean, you can do whatever you want. I mean, no, seriously. I mean, I signed a contract and then I realized it wasn't what I wanted, so I wrote to the editor and I said, can we change this? I mean, they may say yes, they may say no. You have to be willing to see how it's going to turn out, but as they say, it never hurts to ask.
Sarah, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. You should certainly ask. But strictly speaking, the only way you would get out of the contract is if the publisher is in breach in some way. Say, for example, they failed to pay the signature advance. But this is in the UK. I mean, in Europe, without claiming to have any expertise about it, I believe they have more regulations around unfair contracts, which hopefully will extend to the UK eventually. But I believe you have slightly more protection in that area, and it may be that we have that here eventually. But as it stands, the publisher would need to be in breach or generously agree to release you from the contracts.
And the bigger publisher, the bigger organisation you sign a contract to, the more likely they will protect themselves against things like you claiming you didn't understand what you were signing into. They'll have a clause that say you do understand what you're signing into here in that contract. So,
but what about, say, contracts that were drawn up in the days before digital technology, and now suddenly there's ebooks and you fish your old contracts out, yes, and there's no provision for technologies that nobody knew were going to come? I mean, would you say you could go back to a publisher
That's when it can get quite sticky, because some publishers might argue that the wording of the contract did cover ebooks. Sometimes it can be a bit ambiguous, and then you're into an argument about it as to whether it does. But if it is clear, then there should be that it doesn't include ebook rights. There should be an addendum to add those rights on if the publisher then wishes to acquire them. But in any contract you sign now, it's extremely likely it will cover ebook rights as well.
It'll also probably include a definition of software, communication software invented and as yet uninvented, just to cover their backs, for future technology.
Any other questions? No? Okay, well, I think we'll wrap up if nobody's got any more. Okay, thank you all very much, and thank you very much.